Did you know that beneath Grand Central Terminal and its surrounding streets lies a two-level rail yard with 67 tracks capable of handling more than 1,000 trains a day, complete with sidings and service lines running unseen beneath Midtown Manhattan? One of them, hidden under the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, is known as Track 61. Built in the 1910s as part of Grand Central's Lexington Avenue Yard, it began as a freight siding for coal and ash, but by the 1930s, it had been adapted into a private platform, linked to the hotel by a freight elevator large enough for automobiles. Over the years, generals, presidents, and celebrities were rumored to have used it. Andy Warhol even staged a party on its platform in the 1960s, yet most New Yorkers have never seen it, and much of what's said about Track 61 drifts between fact and legend. So, what's the truth behind this legend, and how did a service track become one of the city's most enduring urban myths? Join me to find out, as today we discover the history of New York's Track 61. I'm your host, Ryan Sokesh, and you're watching It's History. By the mid-19th century, rail had already defined New York, but there was a problem. The street level was pure chaos because of it. Freight yards spilled across Manhattan's surface. Coal, cattle, and commuters all tangled together. But by 1844, the Long Island Railroad set a new precedent by ambitiously cutting its own path beneath nearby Brooklyn, boring the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, the first subterranean rail tunnel in North America. It was short, at just a few blocks, but it proved the point. New York's rails could go under the city itself. By 1910, tunnels began crisscrossing the entire metropolis, and Pennsylvania Station pushed that notion even further. In short, the Pennsylvania Railroad tunneled under both the Hudson and the East Rivers, building a fully underground terminal on 7th Avenue. Not to mention that beneath the then-new James Farley Post Office, 6 mail sidings and a maze of elevators connected directly to Penn Station tracks. This was a fantastic improvement for the city. Mailbags rose from trains to sorting floors without ever touching the street. This was true infrastructure buried with precision, a type of factory under the city's skin. But the digging didn't end here, as the boldest move came from New York Central Railroad. It all started after a fatal locomotive collision in the Park Avenue Tunnel in 1902. This is when Manhattan decided to ban steam engines south of the Bronx. Chief Engineer William J. Wilgus seized the moment to electrify the entire system. When Grand Central opened in 1913, it was handling close to 75 million passengers a year, a figure that made it one of the busiest railroad terminals in the world. What's more, between 1903 and 1913, Grand Central was rebuilt as a 2-level terminal. The platforms and storage yards stretched from 42nd Street to about 50th, while the approach tracks extended north beneath Park Avenue itself to around 96th Street, meaning on the surface, the terminal city sprouted with hotels, offices, and towers, all of which was built directly above tracks. The new rail levels fanned out into more than 60 tracks, with sidings tucked into corners to store cars and locomotives between runs. One of those pockets was the Lexington Yard, also called the Lex Yard, carved beneath the east side of the terminal between 42nd and 50th Street. Moreover, it was here that coal trains rolled in to feed the great steam powerhouse on 49th Street, the plant that supplied electricity and heat to Grand Central and the surrounding buildings. Ash was then hauled out the same way it came in, carted across wide platforms between tracks 61 and 63. An interesting note, there was no track 62. Anyhow, freight elevators rose from these platforms to Lexington Avenue, where wagons carried the waste off and into oblivion. Walking through it back then would have felt like entering a dangerous, mechanical underworld, which is in part why few people got to see it with their own eyes. With that in mind, I'd like to offer you a description of what the underworld was like. You'd hear the rumble of ash carts, see coal dust clinging to the girders, and there'd be the smell of steam and oil bleeding into the cavern air. This was the hidden labor that kept the grandeur above running smoothly, but that landscape all changed in 1929, and the powerhouse was demolished to clear way for the esteemed Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the most luxurious building New York had ever seen to that point. And with it, Track 61 lost its original function. Even so, little did the world know that what had once been an ash dock and a service siding was about to become a pivotal rail entrance for the rich and the famous. In 1929, the railroad's power block at 49th Street came down, and the Waldorf Astoria rose in its place. The block between Lexington and Park, 49th to 50th, wasn't empty ground. It was all railroad real estate. You see, when the central power source shifted to Con Ed in 1929, those plants were deemed redundant, and hence the entire block became a development site, though the tracks needed to remain running underneath. According to Joseph Bernan's Grand Central Study, those 4 buildings, barely 20 years old at the time, were explicitly cleared to make way for the new hotel. And I need to point out that the deal making this hotel possible was not a simple land sale. In fact, on September the 8th, 1929, the New York Times claimed that the Hotel Corporation secured a 63-year air rights. It was a lease over the tracks, and the plan explicitly included, quote, a private rail siding underneath the building, with a, quote, special elevator at the siding for arrivals. Construction moved quickly, and by 1931, the hotel opened its doors. 47 stories tall, spanning an entire city block, the largest and tallest hotel in the world at the time. According to Daily Passport, it became a stage for high-profile New York events. Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier's engagement party in 1956, not to mention long stays by Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra. In other words, this building was a symbol of the elite in old-time New York, and it's worth having a look at the architecture. At the very top sat the Waldorf Towers. These weren't ordinary hotel rooms, but long-term apartments designed for figures such as heads of state, magnates, and cultural leaders. The penthouse opened onto private terraces with sweeping views over Park Avenue and east towards the river. Now, on the inside, they were furnished like mansions, with paneled libraries, private dining rooms, and suites grand enough to house people like the former President Hoover, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and General Douglas MacArthur after the war. But the list doesn't end there. Composer Cole Porter lived here for more than 20 years, installing his custom Steinway within the suite. And with that in mind, this hotel was dubbed as New York's most exclusive address. Then, just a few floors down, the building opened into the ballroom level. The grand ballroom could seat over 1,000 guests beneath gilded ceilings and Louis Regal's murals, lit by crystal chandeliers that reflected across silver-leafed walls. The grand ballroom also boasted a hydraulic floor system, allowing the level of the stage and seating area to be raised or lowered depending on the needs, a piece of engineering that matched the theatrical scale of the events hosted there. Next door, the Empire Room staged nightly performances, and the retractable ceiling gave diners a view of the night sky until it was closed in the 1950s. And I need to emphasize here that to attend a banquet at this hotel was to be on display. The Waldorf didn't just host events, it choreographed society itself. And it's here that we need to discuss the notion of one's arrival. As for most of the public guests, like businessmen or well-to-do European tourists, the public promenade began at the lobby. Guests entered beneath bronze doors into a marble-clad hall dominated by the Waldorf Astoria clock, a Victorian relic brought from the original Fifth Avenue Hotel. From there, the visitors flowed into Peacock Alley, a gilded corridor where the city's elite paraded before entry into the ballroom. The decor was layered with bronze, mahogany, and even muraled ceilings. Every surface was designed to project grandeur. But here's the thing. The elite class has a symbolic and sometimes even practical top-down hierarchy when it comes to the gesture of their arrival. Allow me to explain. For the owner of a medium-sized corporation, for example, passing through the Grand Hall of nearby Grand Central, followed by a warm greeting from a porter who promptly took their bags, was sufficient But if you wanted to take it up a level, a bigger statement might include arriving with a private driver, or even your own private car. In fact, the hotel was built with its own private garage, which was a huge rarity at the time. Period descriptions note that the garage was connected to the service core and freight elevators, so cars could be shuttled directly below street level. So that's all good and well, but what if a head of state shows up? Well, motorcades do make a powerful statement, but if you arrive in your own lush private train, and no one even sees you enter, well, that would put you at the very top of the social pyramid. They call this counter-signaling, not to mention that it would keep you safe. And so it's at this point of the architectural tour that the tone shifted. Beyond the public spaces, service corridors funneled staff and freight to the Lexington Avenue side of the estate, where on 49th Street, an unmarked door led to a freight elevator large enough for automobiles. That shaft dropped 2 stories down to a platform carved between tracks 61 and 63, a space originally built to move coal and ash from the demolished powerhouse. So, with the hotel's opening in 1931, this track section was reborn as a private train stop. A guest arriving by private rail car could now step directly into the hotel's back house, unseen from the lobby above. According to that Brennan report, the special elevator envisioned in 1929 was realized as a freight elevator installed during the hotel's construction, where a pipe shaft had previously been. Crucially, it opens to 49th Street, not directly into guest floors. And additionally, there is a secondary stair exit over on 50th. If you ride that elevator down, you'd be at the edge of Grand Central's East Side Service Yard, the old Lexington Avenue yard where the railroad once moved coal and ash from the now demolished powerhouse. The wide platform between tracks 61 and 63 became the hotel's private interface with the railroad, and it's not far away from public view. In fact, some have reported that it's visible from trains as they depart the station, sitting just beyond passenger platforms 11 to 13 and 14 to 15. It's only separated by a ladder track out of the main flow, exactly where discretion thrives. Finally, we know that this elevator was built with the hotel, as it did not appear on that original 1912 plan, confirming that it was made specifically for the arrival of elite guests. And so it was. Track 61 was reborn, and in the decades to follow, it became the setting for some of the city's most curious and enduring stories. To be clear, the Waldorf siding was never presented as a formal passenger station. The first documented arrival on Track 61 happened in April of 1938, when General John J. Pershing, by then the only man to hold the rank of General of the Armies, stepped off a private rail car on Track 61. The New York Times reported that he took the elevator from the siding directly into the hotel, offering the world proof that the underground entrance worked as planned. Though the most famous visit came on October the 21st, 1944, when Franklin D. Roosevelt was campaigning in New York. The Associated Secret Service document read, quote, "The President will leave the hotel over the same route he entered, i.e. via the East Side Lexington Avenue elevator, and will then proceed via New York Central elevators to the New York Central Railroad siding located in the basement of the hotel." William D. Middleton, in his History of Grand Central, added that Roosevelt returned to his Hyde Park home that very night in his own private Pullman car. The Ferdinand Magellan, of course. Other high-profile names followed. For example, in 1951, General Douglas MacArthur used the siding after returning from service in Asia, and according to the Daily Passport, Track 61 was also later placed on the Secret Service's contingency list as an escape route. The New York Post even reported that in 2003, during the UN General Assembly, it was designated as an emergency exit for then-President George W. Bush, Colin Powell, and Condoleezza Rice. And now, the platform was not only used by politicians. Alongside dignitaries, the space occasionally doubled as a stage. In 1946, the New Haven Railroad exhibited a brand new diesel locomotive on Track 61. It was the only time that the platform was ever truly open to the public. Then, in 1948, a fashion show was staged on the platform with the theme of trains in the wardrobe, of course, and famously in 1965, Andy Warhol hosted a subterranean party on the siding, described by Newsday as, quote, a pretty low place for a party, even if catered by the Waldorf. With that all being said, even in its prime, Track 61 wasn't primarily a stage for spectacles. Most of the time, it was nothing glamorous at all. But thanks to its curious nature, legends and stories were basically imagined by people into the space. And these legends and stories started to spread. The allure of secrecy was further fed by the fact that official maps deliberately omitted Track 61 from public diagrams, even though it was visible in the infrastructure itself. This omission created the impression that it was a hidden facility reserved for special use, and indeed it was. Those rumors were further amplified when former railroad employees began spreading rumors about how Roosevelt's bulletproof limousine was rolled off a train and driven onto the freight elevator and then right into the hotel. In fact, this story was also conveyed in a subterranean New York tour where they showed visitors a blue rail car at Track 61 and claimed that that was FDR's secret train car, waiting in the dark since 1945. Then, outlets from CNN to Bloomberg repeated the tale. But the facts don't hold. In 2019, Untapped New York confirmed that the blue baggage car was not Roosevelt's at all. In fact, the Danbury Railroad Museum received it that year and identified it as New York Central Baggage Car MNCX002. This was definitely not a personal carriage of any type. It was a tool car used to carry rigging and equipment for a wrecking crane. NYC Urbanism pointed out how its extra-wide doors were just standard baggage doors, and how Roosevelt's actual automobile transport car was the Baltimore and Ohio number 748. Basically, that blue rail car had been stored under Grand Central for decades and mistaken for something much more important. Even so, the visual of that blue rail car under Manhattan was very potent indeed. It fed the public imagination for years. People pictured convoys of Secret Service vehicles, hidden ramps, and presidential limousines whisked out of sight. Though Roosevelt did use the siding once, a fact that gave the myths just enough weight to live on. Today, Track 61 is sealed off from the public. Its tunnel mouth is visible from certain Metro North trains, but the platform itself is locked and used only for occasional maintenance. Security planning documents still list it as a potential evacuation route for heads of state staying at the Waldorf. A reminder that even in dormancy, it remains of strategic value. A value that was reimagined in other places that tried to create their own private rail access, though few examples match the scale of what we find in New York. In the US, Track 61 really stands out. Even Washington's Union Station, though it hosted presidents and dignitaries, never had a dedicated hotel siding beneath it. Only a few examples can really be found, like in Berlin, where Hotel Adlon maintained a discreet siding throughout the interwar years. In London, Charing Cross Station offered discreet passage for guests of neighboring hotels, but again, it wasn't the same as Track 61 in New York. These arrangements faded with time, but they did demonstrate how Track 61 belonged to a rare class of architecture where rail and hospitality briefly intersected. Over the decades, the platform became more famous in the imagination than in use. Urban explorers, tour guides, and journalists repeated stories of hidden cars, presidential convoys, and escape routes. Documentaries and artifacts treated it as a Cold War bunker or a phantom station, feeding New York's fascination with secret tunnels. When in reality, Track 61 was mostly a storage spur, adapted for hotel use, and later mythologized as a presidential back door. And that's the story of New York's elusive Track 61. I hope you all enjoyed the story. Hit that subscribe button to let me know if you did. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.